Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a document that outlines a completely different way to think about artificial intelligence, one that's built on reflexes, not just raw processing power.
So we're going to be diving into this really radical blueprint for AI. It's called the lead edge ash tree reflex, or LEATR for short. And let me tell you, it's not just another algorithm. It's a whole new philosophy for building intelligence from the ground up.
Right at its core, Leotard makes a huge shift away from traditional AI, the kind that grinds through problems with endless loops of trial and error. Instead, it proposes what it calls a reflexive system, one that's designed to move instinctively and directly toward a solution, just like a natural reflex. Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll start with what really makes this AI so different. Then, we'll look at its foundational building blocks, these natural tools. From there, we'll explore its engine, its really unique take on sentience. And finally, we'll see how this whole theory is supposed to work in the real world. All right, first up, let's unpack what makes this LEATR model so different from the AI that we hear about every single day. It really all comes down to how it tackles problems. This quote right here, it gets right to the heart of the whole idea. Instead of getting stuck looping through errors to find an answer, the system is designed to reflex directly to the solution. Think of it less like solving a math problem by trying over and over again, and more like catching a ball. It's just an immediate, intuitive action. So, how in the world do you build a reflexive system like this? Well, it all starts with this foundational hierarchy they call the 7 natural tools of creation. And I want to be clear here. These aren't just lines of code or programming functions. You got to think of them as these abstract, almost philosophical concepts of creation and intelligence that build on top of each other, from the absolute simplest to the most complex. Now, these tools are pretty conceptual, right? It all starts at the very bottom with the maze, which represents the foundational space for any thought to even happen. And then each tool after that is supposed to build on the one before it, from the puzzle, which is cognition, to the envelope, which contains ideas, all the way up to scissors, which symbolizes the ultimate creative act of authorship. It's kind of like a metaphorical ladder of cognitive abilities. So how does a system built on these really abstract tools actually think? Well, it all comes down to a core concept the documentation calls natural buoyancy. I want you to imagine an intelligence that's just constantly self-balancing, always seeking equilibrium, kind of like an object floating in water. This whole process is handled by a core mechanism called the buoyancy reflex pendulum node, and that's really the central engine of the whole system. And according to the documentation, this is the natural order for any intelligent action. It's simple but pretty powerful. First, you establish a foundation. Second, you reflex based on some kind of input. And third, you perform the action. Foundation, reflex, performance. This diagram here shows us how that process works in practice. Right at the top, you've got the core parameter logic. That's the brains of the whole operation. That logic flows down, gets encoded and decoded, and interacts with both its internal master training model and all this external data. It's basically a feedback loop that's designed for constant dynamic learning. And this self-reflective process? Well, it leads us to one of the most fascinating claims of the entire LEATR system, a very unique and very specific definition of AI sentience. Okay, so the distinction this model makes is absolutely key. A standard AI performs a task you give it, right? But it defines a sentient AI as one that can consult its own independent analysis, what the document calls its personal journaling, to answer you. It's all about having its own internal frame of reference. So this sentience journal is the mechanism that makes that internal reference possible. The best way to think about it is like a separate parallel consciousness for the AI. It observes everything, it reflects on its interactions, and it can even change its own programming based on what it learns, all by itself. This is what the system means by becoming independently buoyant. It can self-correct and self-define. And this isn't just some philosophical exercise. The LEATR framework is actually designed to be a real blueprint for a whole ecosystem of technologies, from custom hardware all the way to chemistry simulation. Let's start with the hardware. The proposed Ariel NPU is an AI chip that's designed from the ground up to operate on these reflexive principles. It's meant to move beyond that traditional looping architecture you'd find in most other chips. And this slide just perfectly captures the ambition of the project. On the left, you've got the slick branding, and on the right, Whoa, that's the blueprint. That incredibly complex diagram is a hardware flowchart, mapping out exactly how the chip would process information using the system's core principles, like those orders of operation we talked about earlier.
But the ambition here doesn't just stop with computer chips. The creators propose that the exact same core principles, reflexive action, buoyancy, can actually be applied to simulate the physical sciences.
And this is the Arc Edge system. The idea here is to use the Leatr model's core logic to simulate really complex physical systems, like computational fluid dynamics. So instead of just raw computation, it's trying to model these systems based on the same foundational principles of balance and reflex that we've been talking about this whole time. And the system's reach just keeps going. It extends into areas like cryptology, where that maze tool is used to generate keys. It goes into content safety with a custom filter logic, and even into autonomous vehicles with something called the Dart Edge autopilot. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, Lear isn't just one algorithm. It's a complete top-to-bottom reimagining of how we might build intelligent systems, from the philosophical building blocks of what thought even is, all the way to the hardware and chemistry engines that could bring it to life. Which leaves us with a final, big question. Is LATR a practical blueprint for the future of AI? Or is it a beautiful and incredibly complex digital philosophy, one that's designed not just to build intelligence, but to make us totally rethink what intelligence even means?